Hello, my name is Malik Jabbar, the author of the book, The Astrological Foundation of the Christ Myth. I want to speak to you today on the subject of the four horsemen of the apocalypse as unveiled in Revelations of the Bible. I want to show the relationship of that biblical story to astronomy and how it relates to cosmic symbolism. Now, the sky map that we have before us, I will use this map to correlate the biblical saga with astronomy and show its relationship and show that the mythology of the four horsemen of the apocalypse is actually based on astro-theology. But before I get started with that, I want us to view a video of Santos Bonacci, who spoke on this subject a while back. He reviewed some of my books and he used them as a reference for speaking on the subject of the four horsemen. So I want us to listen to his video, and after that I will come back to this screen, and with the aid of the graphics that are before us, I will show the correlations, the astro-theological correlations between the biblical myth of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and show that the foundation of this biblical story is actually based on astro-theology or cosmic mythology. So first let us take a listen to Santos Bonacci.
Wonderful writers, okay? They've done some amazing works of art, and I want to show you what's in these books. Here's a guy called Malik H. Jabbar, and he's got five or six books. I think this one might be his sixth book, and this one is a series of 5, and there's a picture of the books there. If you go to his website, this is how he introduces his work. Welcome. This site provides information on the mythological origins of all universal religions. Religious scriptures are a registry of astronomical phenomena, written in a mythological format. The evolution of our modern religious concepts began with astronomy and evolved through mythology and astrology into modern religion. Many of the Hebrew myth concepts are traceable to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Jesus Christ, the Son, God, is a cosmic myth on par with Osiris, Horus, Samson, Adonis, Moses, Abraham, Solomon, Noah, Krishna, Mithra, Quetzalcoatl, and many other solar demigods. Evidence clearly shows that the 12 apostles are symbols of the zodiac sign, and that Jesus Christ symbolized the sun, God, in some aspects a moon god. It is clear that the tales within the Bible are allegorical depictions of the interactions between elements of the cosmos. Religion exists at 2 levels, the esoteric and the exoteric and the esoteric, the inner and the outer. The inner religion is the one where you go within, and the outer one is the book religions, you know. Oh, read the Watchtower and awake, then you'll be saved. They've all got their publications and paraphernalia. That's the exoteric. The inner is you're already equipped with the inner one. That you've got forever. You're never denied that. Anywhere you go in the universe, you are never denied contact with Source. This exposes the foolishness of exoteric religion. Exoteric religion is an invention for teaching the mechanics to children, because that's the way they remember models, and they remember and imprint images and symbols on their minds. But grown-ups are supposed to wake up. Yeah. The exoteric level, literal level of religious philosophy is pure idiocy. To think that the fantastic tales of demons and multi-headed monsters and miraculous events of every stripe, such as making the sun stand still, dividing the Red Sea, destroying the world by flood, and all the other related nonsense, is accepted without hesitation on the basis of faith, is astonishing. Nevertheless, it is so. The esoteric level of religion is a science that is mathematical, coherent, logical, and provable. Well, I've done it, beyond a doubt. But the science of truth is veiled by the mask of mythology. The science of truth is veiled by the mask of mythology. Some are repulsed by this mask and unfortunately turn away and denounce all concepts that support the possible existence of a creator God force. The great majority accepts the myth at face value, believe it or not. But fortunately, there are some that choose the path of investigation, of which you and I are a part. The purpose of these books is to explain the seminal relationship between astronomy, myth, and modern religion. The books prove that ancient myth/religion was in fact a written pictorial symbolic record of the celestial movements within the cosmos, under the type of mythical deities. The history of the biblical Jesus Christ is drawn from the symbolical history of prior sun deities. His birth through to his death, as represented in the Bible, is a symbolical representation of the annual sun cycle and other cycles at different levels of interpretation. Sounds great, doesn't it? And I read that just so that you can get a taste of what this guy's thinking and how his books are just exquisite. I've learnt a lot from him, actually. I've learnt a lot about these cycles from reading his books.
What's his name?
Malik H. Jabbar. And you can get them on Amazon. They're only about $8 a piece. But some of the juicy things that he talks about, it's just amazing. He understands that Jacob, for instance, was the name of the sun below the equator, and Israel, when he gets a name changed, and he wrestles with the angel, and finally he conquers, he gets his name changed to Israel. Right? Abraham used to be Abram. Abram is the sun below the equator. At 90 years of age, 90 degrees, he gets a name change to Abraham. You see, so he's got all that stuff in there. It's just incredible. I'd just like to read a little bit, really some choice stuff from here. The gateways between the lower world and the upper world are the equinoxes. These are gateways. The vernal equinox is the gateway to the higher hemisphere, equated with redemption. And the autumnal equinox is the gateway to the lower hemisphere, equated with suffering and death, according to the ancient symbolism. So when the sun falls below the equinox in the last part of the year and the earth approaches winter, the ancients saw that event as the imprisonment of the sun, or the wounding of the sun, whereas its light was impeded and made ineffective. The imprisonment of Christ and the eventual crucifixion of him is symbolic of the span from the autumnal equinox to the sun's death at the winter solstice in the annual phase of the solar symbolism. Of course, biblically, the resurrection of Christ takes place proximate to the vernal equinox. This is because of the cultural input from the Hebrew Christians who wrote the biblical Christ myth. They fashioned the Christ after the sacrificial lamb of the Passover festival. See, when the sun finally passes over, they sacrifice the lamb, Aries, the Lamb of God. They also linked, the custom of the Jews to sacrifice lambs or goats proximate to the equinoxes, both vernal and autumnal. You see, the goat is Here's the sheep, and here's the goats in Capricorn. Cap. The sheep. See, Capricorn rules the solstice, and Aries rules the equator. So this is in the book of Daniel, where the he-goat and the ram are at loggerheads and they're always chasing each other, right? That's talking about this. That's the goat and that's the sheep. It's the solstices and the equinoxes. It's the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And I'll read that from another one of his books in a minute. But I'll just finish here. The animal was the scape. They also linked this sacrifice, killing of the animal, to the expiation of their sins. The animal was termed a scapegoat that carried the load of punishment for the accumulated sins of the Jewish population. This is where the myth comes from that Jesus died for our sins, for the sins of the world. It is simply a copy of the old pagan superstitious customs of the nomadic Hebrews. The Bible clearly calls Jesus the Passover, that he was a substitute for the lamb of the Jews brought forth to human form under the Christian doctrine, which doctrine was composed of the early Christians who were actually Jews, members of a Jewish sect that later, over time, became distinct as Christians. The Islamic religion, early in its history, acknowledged astrology as a science, officially. So they had the courage to do that because Rome, on the other hand, was killing Hermetists, Huguenots and Waldenses and Socinians, etc. And in the Renaissance, you see, the Renaissance was founded on Hermes, the Prisca Theologia. Giordano Bruno was killed for saying, unless we go back to Hermes, that's why I'm devoting this to Giordano Bruno. Because I, like all these other guys, are continuing to further his work. And most of his work was dealing with this and the fictional aspects of the Bible and teaching that there's only one religion/science in the universe, and that's this, science. Yeah. This is it. This explains us, this describes us, this is what we do, this is it. And there it is. Jesus is there, Peter is there, Jupiter, Paul is there, Apollo, yeah. The sun, yeah. Mercury's there, Hermes, that's John. They're all there. Satan, Saturn, the characters are all there. This is what, everywhere you go in the universe where physical matter appears, there will be 7 shining luminaries or orbs that will produce that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. It's mind over matter. This nature sounds that sound, according to, as he says, nature sounds a 7-key octave. Octave means 8, right? But you know, you always round these like, you know, in music, you've got your 7 diatonic notes, but it's an octave, right? So you round off, we are an octave, or we are a septenary. Everything in our bodies is septenary. The 7 chambers of the brain, 7 chambers of the heart, the 7 orifices in the body, the 7 vital organs, etc., etc. Everything about our nature is septenary. It's a serpent. That's the serpent. And the serpent is sitting here. Ophiuchus is in the sign of Scorpio. Let's have a look at Scorpio. Scorpio with the red star in it. Okay. There is Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer. So Ophiuchus, what he does, he's carrying the serpent, and the serpent's head is right next to the scales of Libra. You see, we saw that before, right? And the serpent is saying to the woman, and Bootes, her husband, is Adam, this is Eve, Virgo. It's saying to her, eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is the good, this is the evil. And the scales are denoting that, because once the sun goes through these signs, it comes to a point where it has to flip over its polarity. It's given an electric summer, but now it has to change its nature. And it must flip that polarity and produce a winter. So it tastes from the tree of good and evil. Having tasted good, now it must have evil. And that's the serpent that is at the tree deceiving the woman, because she eats from it first. Booties follows. So let's have a look at the four horsemen, shall we, of the apocalypse. The white horse symbolises the vernal equinox. The red horse symbolises the autumnal equinox. The black horse, the winter solstice. That's where black Saturn is. And the pale horse, or green, symbolises the summer solstice. You see, green and lush is that horseman of the apocalypse, that cardinal point. And as those, you see, the sun is always depicted being transported around with four horses. Okay, 4 seasons, 4 horses, 4 cardinal points. And as they go around, they have different natures and different qualities. Of course, these are very similar. The equinoxes, right? Spring and autumn are very similar, but summer and winter, big difference. Okay. White is the colour of the good spirit, and in its mythical aspects correlates astronomically to the vernal equinox. Red, the opposite or opponent counterpart of white in much of the symbolism, and represents the autumnal equinox. Matter is counterbalanced by spirit, just as the autumnal equinox is counterbalanced by the vernal equinox. So the red horse is the autumnal equinox, the controller of the entrance into the infernal regions of the lower hemisphere. Black signifies the darkness of the pit of the lower world, where the sun is shrouded by blackness. Green represents the verdant quality of the summer season, brought in by the summer solstice. The Bible uses the term pale horse, but all of the biblical dictionaries define the term pale as synonymous to the colour green. Now, the riders on the horses, they are different. The riders on the horses, one has a scale, that's Libra. And these are the riders of the horses, okay? The riders of the horses are distinct and separate from the horses in terms of their identity. One reason that other scholars over the years and centuries have failed to interpret this symbolism correctly is that they have blended the individual riders and their assigned horses into single entities, which is an error. The riders of the 4 horses are the zodiacal signs that pass over the stations of the horses, cardinal points. During the day, year, or astrological era that may be targeted by the symbolism. The descriptions of the riders give us sufficient information for their identities. He that sat on the white horse had a bow and a crown, which indicates the sector of Sagittarius. Bow and a crown. With the bow. The bow is Caus Australis. That's the bow in the sector of Sagittarius. And the crown is Corona Australis. Remember we spoke about Corona Borealis in Libra, the crown of thorns? Well, this is Corona Australis of that sector. He that sat on the red horse is described as a killer and a disruptor of peace, which indicates the killer scorpion that carries the sting of death, whose venom ushers in the sorrow and misery of the winter season, as the sun dips below the equinoxes, into the sector of Scorpio. He that sat on the black horse carried balances in his hand, which of course is the scales of Libra. He that sat on the pale green horse was called Death, and the governor of hell, which is of course Saturn in Capricorn, the well-known goat devil of the zodiac. And of course this corresponds with the dragon that drew a third part of the stars of heaven. Have you ever heard of that in Revelation? And I saw the dragon, and he hurled a third of God's stars from heaven, right? Well, the constellation of Draco is in Sagittarius, but it goes from Virgo all the way down to Scorpio. That's exactly a third 120 degrees of arc is occupied by Draco on the northern throne. It's a big constellation in the north. We can't see it, but it's up there where the Big Dipper is and all that. And Draco controls the North Pole. He gets about 3 stars to sit on the North Pole during the 24,000 year precessional cycle. So he's basically the boss, right? And when Draco goes down, in other words, from Virgo downwards, this is the sign of betrayal, Virgo, the dragon hurls 1/3 of God's angels down to the earth. We are told by these verses of the Bible that the dragon's tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven. This symbolism points directly to the zodiacal signs Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius and Capricorn, which are situated right in the fold of the dragon's tail. I have explained conclusively in Book 4, he's got his 5 books here, that the dragon of the apocalyptic heavens of the Bible symbolises the constellation Draconis with the stellar symbolism. The tail of the biblical dragon of the heavens in the Bible is synonymous to the tail of the cosmic dragon, which is in fact the constellation Draconis. The constellation of Draconis stretches over nearly half of the sky's celestial longitude, and at the time of the biblical editing, the tail of Draconis traversed the span of the zodiac stretching from the autumnal equinox through the winter solstice, a span of 4 zodiacal constellations, thus denoting the fall of the sun into the lower regions of the cosmos, as demarcated by the celestial equator.
It is interesting to note that even to this day, the Jews call the beginning of fall-winter weather Judgment Day. This occurs in the first month of the Jewish civil year, which begins with the first new moon after the sun falls below the celestial equator in the Jewish calendar month of Tishri. The first day of Tishri is called Rosh Hashanah, which means the head of the year, the new year. But it is also called Yom Hadin, which means Judgment Day. So that is very interesting. Okay, at this point, I will begin an explanation of the graphics that we have before us so that we can correlate the Bible symbolism to their cosmic counterparts. Okay, we have up here 2 books that I wrote, The Astrological Foundation of the Christ Myth, Book 4, and Lifting the Gnostic Veil. Much of the information that Santos Bonacci referred to and quoted from concerning the red dragon and the apocalypse came from these 2 books. I've written 7 books on this subject, but most of what he was talking about came from these 2 books. So I've put those there for your reference. And over here we have some verses from the 12th chapter of Revelations. And just to read a few lines from here that refer to the subject at hand. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his head. And his tail drew the 1/3 part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them down to the earth. Okay, you know, this is in our Bible, and we go to the Bible as trying to find a connection to God and meaning to our life and so forth. And the Bible includes many passages like this in the book of Revelation, in Daniel, Genesis, Isaiah, Jeremiah, in many other parts of the Bible, the New Testament and the Old Testament. My point is, this is obviously mythology. How could it be anything else? We're dealing with a dragon so big that he can bring down a third of the stars of heaven. So it shows that these passages and the Bible itself is a book that has to be interpreted to be understood and to gain its true value. But anyway, the dragon that's referred to here in its cosmic counterpart within cosmic mythology, that's referring to the constellation of Draco right here. Draco's kind of centered. And we also have Draco to the right in this other graphic. Now we have two types of graphics here. This is the regular spherical graphic that portrays the sky as we actually see it, as a sphere or as a dome above us. But this here is a Mercator projection. The purpose of this is to make it easier for us to analyze the various sections of the sky. This is simply a flat projection of the sphere. You can notice how Draco is actually a very twisting and winding constellation. But when we put it in a Mercator projection, it is straightened out somewhat, so it's not to scale. But this allows us to examine the coordinates in a much clearer fashion. Now, these vertical divisions, they're each 30 degrees wide, and they each represent a zodiacal sign. You know, there are 12 zodiacal signs, and each one comprises or covers 30 degrees of the sky. 12 of them in total, making 360 degrees. And so each of these vertical sections, the whole sky is not represented, of course, because we don't need to represent the whole sky for what we're discussing. But each of these vertical sections here is 30 degrees wide, and the width of a zodiacal section. Okay, it's important to understand too that right here on this line, on this horizontal line here, that is the line of the celestial equator. The celestial equator divides the upper hemisphere from the lower hemisphere. The lower hemisphere is related to suffering and hardship and so forth in the astro-theological symbolism I'm talking about. And the higher hemisphere is related to pleasantness and success and peace and happiness and so forth. So they are diametric opposites in terms of their influence. The upper hemisphere and the lower hemisphere below the celestial equator. The celestial equator is simply the Earth equator extended into the heavens. From that coordinate on Earth, we look into the infinite heavens, and the celestial equator is used by the astronomers and has been by the ancient astronomers as well as the modern astronomers to divide the heavens into two divisions, upper and lower. That division is made and always has been made by means of the celestial equator. Now, we see this curving dotted line here, that is the path of the ecliptic. The ecliptic is the path of the sun, that the sun travels throughout the year. We see the path, the line is up above the celestial equator at a certain point, and we see it's passing down below the celestial equator. But the sun spends half the year above the celestial equator and half the year below the celestial equator. And what else do we need to point out before we get to our explanations here? Okay, this we notice with the ecliptic we see various constellations here. Leo, Virgo. This is the zodiac band. The zodiac band, it follows the path of the ecliptic, of course. Whenever the sun is in a particular sign, the symbolism is under the influence of that sign. And some of the zodiacal signs that the sun passes through are shown through along this band. Now our focus is on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, because we are taught by the preachers from the Bible that the 4 horsemen will usher in the judgment of the world. Bonacci went over this, so I'm not going to repeat much of what he said, but I'm going to show you how these horsemen correlate to the night sky and to seasonal transition. But we are told that these horsemen would usher in the judgment of the world, and that's found in the 6th chapter of Revelation, the complete story about the 4 horsemen. But they are described as a rider upon a white horse carrying a bow and a crown, and a rider upon a red horse that was a killer and disruptor of peace, a rider upon a black horse who was carrying scales in his hands, and a rider of a pale horse who was described as the governor of Hades, the governor of hell. And these 4 horsemen are the horsemen of the apocalypse that will usher in the judgment in the last days. And as I said earlier, there's no such thing as a judgment, never has been and never will be, of this world. And that this is actually referring to seasonal transition. So we have a description of those horses and those, of those riders. The horses actually refer to the cardinal points, but of those riders. And the description clearly refers to 4 constellations that usher in the fall-winter season of persecution that the ancients suffered so many years ago when these symbolisms were first composed. And we can see them here. As I said, the division of the sky is the celestial equator. This line right here at 0 degrees, if you could see it. And up above it, as I said earlier, is the upper hemisphere, and below it is the lower hemisphere. But now you see the path of the ecliptic as it dips under the celestial equator, and this is circa 126 BC, during the era of Aries Pisces, when this was written, because the constellation actually shifts with time, but we won't get into that. But this represents the representation of this sky map here. It reflects the era when this symbolism was written. But anyway, you notice that the first constellation that the sun encounters once it passes below the celestial equator is right here. This is Libra. That is the horsemen that carry the scales. And next is Scorpio. That is the killer, the disruptor of peace. Next, right here, is Sagittarius. That is the rider with the bow and the crown. And then right at the bottom, at the pit of hell, the lowest point of the sun's journey, is Capricorn, which is the governor of hell. Now, I don't think it could be any more clear. You can reread it and review it yourself. It's very vivid, I think. Those are the description given of the four riders of the horses of the apocalyptical riders are clearly the description, according to the description given in the Bible, clearly the constellations of Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, and Capricorn. As I said, this indicates the transition from the pleasant seasons of the upper hemisphere into the oppressive season of experience in the lower hemisphere. Now, we also know that according to the Bible, this great dragon, which I've already explained that the dragon refers to Draco, Draconis, that this dragon brought down to the earth a third of the stars of heaven. Now, as I said earlier, each zodiacal sign has a width of 30 degrees. And so the four horsemen of the apocalypse, representing four zodiacal signs, we multiply 4 times 30. In total, they cover 120 degrees. Now, we know the total circumference of the sky is 360 degrees. So actually, these four horsemen of the apocalypse, they represent, these four constellations, they represent 1/3 of the width of the sky, or the stars of heaven, you know. And not only that, we go up here to the constellation Draconis, we can see that these divisions, they run lateral to the tail of the constellation Draconis. As I said, Draconis represents the dragon. So here, the ancients were saying in their symbolism to those who are enlightened for the period of time that this was written in, the tail runs lateral to the four constellations that represent the ushering in of judgment, and that judgment was not any world judgment, but a judgment that refers to the transition of seasons, which was a very perilous times. One problem that people have is in this modern time when we have great conveniences in terms of going through winter. It's really not a big deal. We can just turn up the heat as hot as we want it. But there was a time when people went through the winter with no heat at all, or very little heat. Perhaps an open flame in a pit in the floor. And they lived through the winter in mud huts, in grass huts. There were no roads, and the food and the water were limited. These were perilous times for the people. And it was in those times that they composed this symbolism. And so that's what it means. Now, hopefully I've covered most of the important points of this symbolism. You can go to my site, malikjabbarbooks.com, and read excerpts on this and other subjects. But my books cover all the symbolism of the Bible, the Old and New Testament, and we prove that the Bible is a book of cosmic mythology. There's just no doubt about it. It's plain and vivid once you get into the subject. And what I've given here is an overview, and behind Mr. Bonacci, they gave a good explanation of these things also. But for a detailed step-by-step explanation and many graphs such as these that you're looking at, I think this book, the Astrological Foundation of Christ, book 4, I think there are about 30 or more graphs within that book that help facilitate the explanation. So that's about it. I appreciate your time. Thank you.